Hi, this is Abby Voss, and this is my passage analysis of Jane Eyre chapter 22. Moving on to the passage, let's begin. He did not leave the stile, and I hardly liked to ask to go by. I inquired soon if he had not been to London. Yes, I suppose you found that out by second sight. Mrs. Fairfax told me in a letter. And did she inform you of what I went to do? Oh, yes, sir. Everybody knew of your errand. You must see the carriage, Jane, and tell me if you don't think it will suit Mrs. Rochester exactly, and whether she won't look like Queen Boadicea, leaning back against those purple cushions. I wish, Jane, I were a trifle better adapted to match with her externally. Tell me now, fairy as you are, can't you give me a charm, or a philter, or something of that sort, to make me a handsome man? It would be past the power of magic, sir. And in thought I added, a loving eye is all the charm needed. To such you are handsome enough, or rather your sternness has a power beyond beauty. Mr. Rochester had sometimes read my unspoken thoughts with an acumen to me incomprehensible. In the present instance he took no notice of my abrupt vocal response, but he smiled at me with a certain smile he had of his own, and which he used but on rare occasions. He seemed to think it too good for common purposes. It was the real sunshine of feeling. He shed it over me now. "Pass, Janet," said he, making room for me to cross the stile. "Go up home, and stay your weary little wandering feet at a friend's threshold." All I had now to do was to obey him in silence. No need for me to colloquise further. I got over the stile without a word, and meant to leave him calmly. An impulse held me fast. A force turned me round. I said, or something in me said for me, and in spite of me, "Thank you, Mr. Rochester, for your great kindness. I am strangely glad to get back again to you, and wherever you are is my home, my only home." I walked on so fast that even he could hardly have overtaken me if he tried. Little Adele was half wild with delight when she saw me. Mrs. Fairfax received me with her usual plain friendliness. Leah smiled, and even Sophie bid me bonsoir with glee. This was very pleasant. There is no happiness like that of being loved by your fellow creatures, and feeling that your presence is an addition to their comfort. I that evening shut my eyes resolutely against the future. I stopped my ears against the voice that kept warning me of near separation and coming grief. When tea was over, and Mrs. Fairfax had taken her knitting, and I had assumed a lower seat near her, and Adele, kneeling on the carpet, had nestled close up to me, and a sense of mutual affection seemed to surround us with a ring of golden peace, I uttered a silent prayer that we might not be parted far or soon. But when, as we thus sat, Mr. Rochester entered, unannounced, and looking at us seemed to take pleasure in the spectacle of a group so amicable. When he said he supposed the old lady was all right now that she had got her adopted daughter back again, and added that he saw Adele was prête à rejoindre sa petite maman anglaise, I half ventured to hope that he would, even after his marriage, keep us together somewhere under the shelter of his protection, and not quite exiled from the sunshine of his presence. All right, now let's move into the analysis. The first thing that I highlighted was the Queen Boadicea. This is an illusion, and upon looking it up, I found that Queen Boadicea is often described as manly and in a way ugly because of her stature and her bold features. She's extremely tall, and she has incredibly long and big red hair. So Bronte does this to show that the marriage is focused on looks and making Rochester look good in general. So he brings up this woman who, in actuality, she ends up coming to ruin. She and her daughters are attacked after her husband dies, and then she goes into war, and she ends up needing to take poison so as to not be captured by the enemy. But it's as if Bronte is foreshadowing the danger of this marriage, and because it's based on looks, how it will come to ruin. The next thing, also an illusion, the purple cushions. Purple in this time is the color of royalty. It's expensive to make and expensive to buy. So pointing this out, that it's purple is Rochester puffing himself up. He's showing how rich he is, and he's boasting to Jane of uh, how much his wealth can do him. So it's as if he's trying to look really good to her, which is ironic because he's supposed to be getting married and he shouldn't care what other people think. Um, Moving on to how Rochester calls Jane a fairy. Um, this is interesting because I looked it up, and fairies really, the point is that they have magical powers. They're something beyond human. Um, so he's complimenting her here. He's trying to get something from her, so he's trying to coax her to say these things with, you know, flowery words. And then the diction he uses with the words charm and something like that is he's implying that he has nothing in himself and he needs outside and unnatural assistance to be seen as handsome, which is again ironic because he's wanting his wife to look good and he wants uh, them as a couple to look good with how much he's spending on carriages and things like that. But he's still ironically not confident in that. Next, I pointed out a loving eye. So here this is synecdoche that he's not just an eye, but that the eye of the beholder, something to do with that she's desiring his attention, and that's used with the eye. Also, the fact that she says his sternness has a power beyond beauty is really classic for Gothic literature. His mystery and authority is something that attracts Jane and that we see coming through with the Gothic style to this story. Moving on to where Rochester calls Jane to go home, and he tells her to stay your weary little wandering feet at a friend's threshold. So the first thing I wanted to point out there is that he's belittling her physically by her weariness and the size of her feet, making her feel inferior, and then also mentally by saying that she's wandering, almost as if she needs someone to guide her. And then a friend's threshold. It's ironic because it would be a term of endearment because she'd be going home to his home, even though he's about to get married, so he should be focused on that. So that's another interesting thing. Moving on, Jane says all I had to do now was to obey him in silence. This use of degrading language that he had used earlier, like little wandering, and even earlier, this has given her somewhat of a comfort that she knows what she has to do. It removes some of the mystery of that Gothic man because she knows what he desires, and so she's able to comfortably do that. But then we see she can't contain that, and that there's this juxtaposition there that she still feels the need to say something. But that's interesting. Also, that she says, "Wherever you are is my home, my only home." This is a metaphor because clearly he's not, a home, but she's saying that she feels at home with him, she's comfortable with him, and like like someone would be in their own home. Moving on to the next little bit. So it says, little Adele was half wild with delight when she saw me. Mrs. Fairfax received me with her usual plain friendliness. Leah smiled, and even Sophie bid me bonsoir with glee. This string of short subject-verb clauses shows Jane feeling like things are moving on steadily, that she's able to get away without Rochester asking her why she would say such things, and the questionable things that she said are not being brought back up, and she's comforted by that. And then she goes on to say, this was very pleasant. There is no happiness like that of being loved by your fellow creatures, and feeling that your presence is an addition to their comfort. Now, this would be a universal truth, but even in the midst of that, she is belittling again. She's understating her peers by calling them fellow creatures, taking away their humanity there, and we see that she really does see herself as inferior to Mr. Rochester, and because of that, her peers must also be um, lower than her, or lower than Mr. Rochester. The next thing I wanted to point out was Jane says she shut her eyes resolutely against the future. This imagery of almost a childlike, if I can't see you, you can't see me. That picture of her knowing that it's going to come, but she doesn't want to have to deal with it. That's an interesting thing. Also, Jane makes this point where she says, I had assumed a lower seat near Mrs. Fairfax as she had taken her knitting, which is a normal thing, and Adele, kneeling on the carpet, had nestled up close to me, and a sense of mutual affection seemed to surround us with a ring of golden peace. Jane's listing all these things that would make someone comfortable. They're all sitting, they're leaning up against each other, they're comfortable, and there's this ring of golden peace. And yet there's this juxtaposition of Jane's inner turmoil as she's dealing with this marriage and she knows she won't be happy. But she's attempting to be anyway for Mr. Rochester's sake. So that's interesting. And then with the ring of golden peace, that's another interesting image that we see here. The word ring here is a binding thing. They're all together and it bonds them. It's ironic because she knows that Rochester will be getting married, but she's hoping that the new marriage will not break the bond and that his quote unquote marriage with his underlings is, and this comforting, family that they have together, she's hoping that won't be broken. It's also interesting that Jane, because of what Mr. Rochester says when he comes in, says she half ventured to hope. These hedging words are so interesting because she knows it's unlikely, but she's really clinging to just this little bit of hope that Rochester will do what she's praying for. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was that Jane says that they don't want to be exiled from the sunshine of Rochester's presence. Now, of course, sunshine is a metaphor here. He isn't sunshine. He can't give them sunshine. But she feels this warmth because of him that makes her feel like she can't live without it, and that sunshine is what we see there as her diction. So I hope that helps with studying, and I hope that everything works out with the AP test. Thank you for listening.